So let's build this card component, which I want to have around my form together. So here in add user, I want to be able to wrap this in a card component, which doesn't exist yet, like this. And that should apply a nice styling here to this form. For that, I'll go to the UI folder and in there add a card.js file. Now in there, I'll create a pretty much standard React component. So we import React from React. We then have card here, which gets props, and we export this as our component. Now, the card component can be fairly trivial. I want to return a div, let's say, and inside of that div, I want to output the content which this card component is wrapped around. So when I wrap card around my form here, this form should of course be output inside of the card. So the card component here should output what's passed between the opening and closing tags of card. And you learned that you can access this content on the special children prop, like this. You put that between curly braces because it's not JSX code, it's a JavaScript expression that should be evaluated inside of the JSX code. And props children will give us that content which is passed between the opening and closing tag of the card component. Now, I will also assign a class here so that we can style it. And now I want to use CSS modules here. You don't need to use that. You could use styled components. You could use regular CSS classes and make sure that you don't repeat class names. But I will use CSS modules. And therefore, I'll add a card.module.css file here where I can specify my card styles. I will add a card class in there, just like this, a normal CSS class, and give it a background of white. Whoops, that should be background. Give it a box shadow of 0, 2 pixels, 8 pixels, RGBA 0000.26, which will add a little bit of a drop shadow to the card, and a border radius of 10 pixels here for rounded corners. Now in card.js, we can import this. Here we can import /card.module.css. And you'll learn that for CSS modules, you now have to alter this import a little bit. This import would be right if you have a non-module file, if you used regular CSS. But if you want to use that CSS modules feature, you have to import something, for example, classes, from that file. And now here on class name, we can assign one of the classes we have inside of the CSS file. In this case, we of course have only one class, that's the card class. So we can just access classes.card here. And this will assign this generated unique class name to that div. And with that, the only step that is left to have that finished card and to use it is to go to the add user component where I want to use that card and import it here, because you always need to import what you want to use. If you have a component in a different file and you want to use it in this file, you have to import it from that other file. Otherwise, JavaScript and this React build process here can't make a connection between this file and the file in which your component is defined. So here we can therefore import card from ... to go up one level, so to go out of that users folder into the components folder, and then into UI, and then to card. And you omit the file extension here for JavaScript files. With that, we're importing card, and if we now saved it, it should compile fine. And this looks a little bit nicer, but of course it's still not the final look I want. Now, to get that nicer look, attached you find a CSS file. To be precise, you find the adduser.module.css file. And you can simply drag and drop that. So download it and then drag and drop it into your users folder next to the add user component. This file includes a couple of styles which will help us make this look nicer. Now to use this file, we have to go to add users, to the add user component. And besides importing the card here, we can now also import classes from that newly added CSS file. So from the adduser.module.css file. For non-JavaScript files, you need to add that file extension here. And now to apply that, I want to go to my card and actually add the class name property here and add classes.input. The input class is defined here in the CSS file, and with that we can add it. But now there's one important thing to note. Of course, here card is our custom component. It's not one of those built-in HTML components. And therefore, since it's our own component, it only has the props, or it only is able to work with the props we use inside of that component. Now, these default HTML components like form, label, input, divs, and so on, they are all pre-configured by React to, for example, work with the class name prop and to then apply a fitting CSS class to the underlying rendered HTML node. Now, for our own component, it of course does not know what to do with the class name prop because it's just our own component, not a built-in HTML component. So we have to go to our own component and make sure that we accept an incoming class name prop and that we do something with it. Now, what do we want to do? In the end, I want to make sure that the CSS class we're applying to the div with the help of class name on that div, that the classes applied to the div reflect both the card class, which we already are applying, as well as any potentially incoming classes on the class name prop of this card component. So that any class I add here on the card component when I use it is in the end applied together with the card class to the div which is rendered by the card. So I want to apply two CSS classes, one coming from the card module CSS file and one coming from outside, from the props, potentially coming via props. And we can easily make this work. We can add a template literal here as a value for class name on the div, and then inject something dynamically with this $ curly brace syntax and add classes.card. That is what we added before as well. But now I'll inject a second value, and that's props.className. Now it's your component, so you could use any property name here. It doesn't have to be class name here on your own props object. I'm just using class name here as well, so that we're able to use our own component just as we work with regular HTML components. I can now set class name on my own component as well, because I'm accepting and using the class name prop here inside of the component. If we would have chosen a different name here, like CSS class for example, we would need to use that CSS class name here as well when we use the card component. But again, I want to have one API, one way of assigning CSS classes, and therefore I will use class name because that's also what React uses for its built-in HTML components. And with that, we're merging an external class with our internally defined class here. And if I now save this now looks much nicer thanks to the styles set up in the add user component. And with that, this looks not too bad. Now let's make sure we also have a nice looking button. And for that, you actually find a file attached to the next lecture, the button.module.css file, and you can use this to try and build your own button. Otherwise, we'll build and use that button together in the next lecture.